Alloa sits on the banks of the River Forth, just west of Stirling, in the shadow of the Ochil Hills. Today it's a small town, quiet and mostly residential, but its roots go deep. Alloa's history stretches back to the early medieval period, and its fortunes have long been tied to trade, river access and powerful families. One of the most important sites in Alloa is Alloa Tower, a striking, thick-walled structure dating back to the late 14th century. It's one of the oldest and best preserved tower houses in Scotland, and as we find out later, it's also haunted. For centuries, it was the seat of the Erskine family, later Earls of Mar, who were close allies to kings and played key roles in Scottish politics. Mary Queen of Scots visited the tower, so did James VI. But long before the grandeur of the Renaissance court, Alloa had strategic value. It lies near Stirling, a crucial crossing point between the Highlands and Lowlands, and was once part of the lands held by Robert the Bruce's allies. The Bruces themselves had ties to the region. Documents from the 14th century show land grants and transactions involving local nobility loyal to the Bruce cause. After the Wars of Scottish Independence, the area became part of the rebuilding of royal and noble influence in the Central Belt. Later, in the 18th and 19th centuries, Alloa grew into a busy industrial town. Shipbuilding, glassmaking and coal mining drove the local economy. The river made it a natural hub for exporting goods. A network of railways and canals strengthened its position further, and the town saw rapid expansion. With that came wealth, and with wealth came the grand homes, estates and family tombs, now scattered through the region. By the late 1800s, Alloa had begun to change. Industrial decline would come in the 20th century, and while the factories faded, the older parts of the town remained. The cemeteries, churches and stone buildings carried traces of the town's past, and among them stands one of its most unusual structures, an overgrown family tomb that, until recently, had been mostly forgotten. But before that story begins, it helps to understand the layers of Alloa's past. This wasn't just another quiet market town. Its position made it valuable, a link between river and road, castle and countryside. People here came to trade, to settle, and sometimes to disappear. Near the centre of Alloa, in the shadow of ivy-covered walls and old yew trees, stands the Tate family tomb. Built in the 1800s and hidden away in the town's main cemetery, it's easy to overlook. The structure is solid and square, made from grey stone with heavy doors and an iron gate that has long since rusted in place. Its design reflects the era, practical, restrained, and built to last. The Tates were not minor figures. By the mid-19th century, they had established themselves as prominent local landowners and industrialists. They made their money in brewing and owned property across Clackmannanshire. Records from the time show that members of the family sat on local councils and contributed to civic developments, including church renovations and charitable works. Their name appears in newspapers and legal notices throughout the latter half of the century. Like many prosperous Victorian families, the Tates took care to secure their legacy. A private tomb, separate from the public burial ground, was both a symbol of status and a reflection of the time's beliefs around death, remembrance, and family pride. It was a common practice among the town's elite, particularly those involved in trade and industry. These tombs weren't built for ostentation. They were intended as lasting memorials, places where the family name could be kept safe, even in death. Over the years, the Tate tomb fell out of regular use. Later generations moved away, and by the 20th century, few in Alloa still knew much about the family. Local archives preserve their names in wills and land deeds, but to most passers-by, the tomb is just another part of the old cemetery, a lonely sealed-off remnant of a time when legacy mattered more than visibility. It's been decades since anyone was last interred there. The structure now shows sign of age, moss at the corners, rust on the hinges, and hairline cracks along the stonework. Yet it remains intact, solid, heavy, unmoved by the years. What drew the Tate family to build such a place in Alloa isn't hard to guess. Their ties to the town were strong, and in the 19th century, a tomb like this offered not only a final resting place, but a mark of permanence. Even as businesses changed hands and fortune shifted, the tomb stood as a reminder of the family's presence, a stone marker in the heart of a town they helped shape. For decades, the Tate family tomb stood largely undisturbed. It was noted in local records, marked on cemetery maps, and occasionally mentioned during heritage walks. But few gave it much thought. That changed in the autumn of 2017. Council workers were clearing overgrown sections of the cemetery when they came across the entrance to the tomb. Thick vegetation had all but hidden it from view. The gate was rusted shut, the steps leading down barely visible beneath moss and soil. It wasn't clear at first whose tomb it was. The nameplate was worn with age. But once identified, it drew interest from local historians and newspapers alike. The local newspaper, the Alloa Advertiser, ran a short piece about the rediscovery. At first it was treated as a curiosity, a Victorian tomb long sealed and largely forgotten, uncovered by accident in the middle of a public cemetery, a reminder of the town's industrial past. But as photos circulated and the interior was inspected, interest deepened. Inside, the chamber was small and dim. The original ironwork and masonry remained mostly intact. A stone slab bore the names of those buried within, several members of the Tate family, spanning a period of roughly 50 years. Thankfully, there was no vandalism, no signs of forced entry, just time, dust, cobwebs, and the faint smell of damp stone. Following the rediscovery, the area was cleared and the site made more accessible. The cemetery's management put up a simple plaque and tidied the surrounding paths. For a few weeks, the tomb became a local point of interest. Some came just out of curiosity, others to take photos. A few came to pay respects, uncertain of the family's history, but struck by the idea that something long buried had come back into view. And then, slowly, other stories began to surface. Those who visited sometimes mentioned strange feelings around the tomb, a sudden drop in temperature, a pressure in the chest, or the sense of being watched. Others mentioned camera failures or distorted photos. Some dismissed these as tricks of light or imagination, but a few of their accounts were harder to ignore. At first these reports remained informal, comments made online, overheard in the pub, or passed on by cemetery staff. It wasn't enough to draw major attention, but for those who lived nearby or walked the cemetery often, stories of the tomb had shifted in tone. It was no longer just a forgotten corner of Alloa's past. It had become something else, something frightening. After the site was opened in 2017, local council workers were tasked with assessing its condition. On paper, it was a straightforward job, routine clearance and inspection. But what followed left several of those involved with more questions than answers. One of the first workmen to enter described an immediate change in temperature. It was warm all day, they told a local reporter, but when we stepped inside, it felt like a freezer. No draft, just cold. Not the kind you get from the shade, the kind you feel in your bones. Another worker reported a strange sound, what they described as a soft tapping, like someone knocking gently, from inside the stone. At first, they assumed it was just debris shifting, or one of the others working nearby. But when they asked, no one else had heard it. It wasn't constant, the worker explained. It was just once or twice, but it was enough. The third declined to re-enter after their initial visit. According to the article, they later asked to be reassigned, saying simply that the space made them feel off. No dramatic story, no specific incident, just a stone-cold refusal to go back inside. Word of the tomb's opening spread quickly. Alloa is a small town and stories travel fast. Some locals joked about ghosts, others took it more seriously. A few spoke about bad luck. They seemed to follow the family. But even among those who dismissed such talk, the sense of discomfort hung around the tomb. People began walking a little faster past the site. Someone tied a bunch of artificial flowers to the gate, but no one seemed eager to see it opened again. When it was opened, there was no evidence of vandalism, no bones disturbed, no records of anything untoward. But something about the place left a mark. Not a visible one, but one that stayed with those who stepped inside. And that, perhaps, is what makes this haunting unusual. There's no story of a ghostly figure in the doorway, or a cry in the night. Nothing to photograph or prove, just a series of reactions, subtle but consistent, from those who had no reason to invent them. Not long after the tomb was uncovered, a story began circulating about a bus passenger. It wasn't new, exactly. Versions of it had been told before. But something about the timing made people sit up and take notice. The story goes that on certain nights, usually in the colder months, drivers on the late-night bus route passing the cemetery have reported seeing a lone figure waiting near the gates. A man, middle-aged or older, wearing dark clothing and standing still. Too still. The drivers would slow, expecting him to wave them down, but he never did. If the bus stopped anyway, the man would be gone. One driver, convinced he'd seen someone, even opened the doors, stepped out and looked around. Nothing. Even a few passengers reported similar sightings. Glimpses of someone standing in the path, facing away from the road. One woman told a friend she assumed it was a mourner, lingering late, but when I looked again, she said, there was nobody there. No way they could have walked off that fast, not on that ground. Around the same time, cemetery visitors began speaking more openly. One woman who regularly walked her dog through the grounds said her pet refused to go near the tomb. She thought it was just the scent of metal or decay. Until the dog began growling at nothing, repeatedly. Another visitor, a local amateur photographer, tried to capture images of the site at dusk. The first time, their camera battery drained instantly, despite being fully charged. The second time, they returned with a new battery, only to find the photos blurred, distorted, or seemingly blank in sections, as if the lens had been smeared or the light warped. None of this amounts to definitive proof, rarely does. But the consistency of the unease among unrelated people on different days in different conditions paints a picture. The rediscovery of Tate's tomb did more than disturb ivy and rust. It reopened a space that, for whatever reason, had fallen silent. And now, with that silence broken, something stirs again. Seen in the corner of an eye, felt in the sudden drop of temperature, or heard in the strange silence of a bus passing through the dark. What is it about tombs that unsettles us so deeply? Maybe it's the sense that we're intruding, that behind the gates, the railings, the stonework, carved with names long faded, there's something that should be left undisturbed. Not because it's dangerous, but because it's finished, final. And when something begins to stir again in those places, when stories emerge of movement, of sightings, of unease, it challenges that assumption. It suggests that maybe the past isn't done. Tate's tomb isn't the only burial site with an atmosphere that seems to bleed into the surrounding streets. There's a much more famous example just outside central London, Highgate Cemetery. Highgate has long been considered one of Britain's most haunted places. In the 1970s, a wave of reports emerged, sightings of a tall, dark figure with glowing eyes moving between the headstones. Dead animals were found near the gates. A group of self-styled vampire hunters broke in. The press descended, and the story spiraled. What began as a quiet local story turned into a frenzy. Books were written and documentaries made. But what's interesting is how it started. Before the vampire panic, before the headlines, Highgate had already built a reputation among locals. They spoke of cold spots, of strange shadows, of something oppressive near the Egyptian Avenue and the Circle of Lebanon, areas thick with mausoleums and elaborate tombs. The atmosphere seemed heavier there, as if time had caught in the stonework, as if something had gone unresolved. And maybe that's what links it to Alloa. The reports about Tate's tomb are nowhere near as sensational, but they share the same tone. People speak of a feeling, of things seen near the railings or sensed at the edge of the path. And what stands out most is that these stories often surface after a disturbance, after something is reopened, broken into, and moved. At Highgate, that disturbance came in the form of vandalism and sensationalism. In Alloa, it may have been something as simple as attention returning to a place long left alone. Stories like these remind us that hauntings don't always need a clear figure. Sometimes it's not about a ghost, a name, or a face. It's about a space that feels wrong, a place where something's been interrupted. In both Highgate and Alloa, the dead were given places of honour, vaults, tombs, names, carved in stone. But time passed, names faded, gates rusted, and eventually, silence gave way to something else. Not all of Alloa's stories come from burial grounds. Some belong to places still standing, buildings with long histories and longer memories. If the story of Tate's tomb is about disturbance, then Alloa Tower is more about perseverance. A place where the past hasn't faded, but remains with us in subtle ways. Footsteps where there should be none, voices behind locked doors, and rooms that seem to hold on to what they once saw. Rising from the centre of Clackmannanshire, just past the old kirkyards and river bends, Alloa Tower has stood for over 700 years. Its thick stone walls and narrow windows have witnessed the town change from a royal outpost to an industrial town, and then into something more suburban. But inside the tower, that shift hasn't fully happened. Time doesn't feel settled. The hauntings at Alloa Tower have been reported across hundreds of years, and it seems hauntings are reported in all of the main areas of the castle: dungeons, halls, bedrooms, even archives. In the dungeon, in particular, the atmosphere is thicker than anywhere else. People have reported seeing two figures, an older man chained and wounded, and a girl kneeling beside him. Some believe she's tending to his leg, bitten by rats. Whether it's an act of kindness or something darker isn't clear, but the feeling left behind stays with people long after they leave the room. The Great Hall, now open to the public, has its own strange presence. A sealed stone well sits off to one side, easy to overlook. But some have heard sounds coming from it, a girl crying, or a man's voice raised in panic. One investigator described seeing a figure in old clothing leaning over the well, as if trying to reach something. When they got too close, they were shoved backwards. Not attacked. Not exactly. More like warned. On the upper floors, the sightings become more detailed. A woman in black has been seen standing next to a cradle. She's never been heard speaking. She simply stands there, watching the cradle. The cradle itself has its own story. It's said to have been used by James VI as an infant, although most believe it's a reproduction. During a tour, a disembodied voice was once reported saying, "It doesn't belong here." What the voice meant is still unclear. Another story concerns the fire that destroyed the mansion house attached to the tower in 1800. The fire was blamed on an unfortunate maid's candle. On its anniversary, the smell of smoke has been reported in the rooms above. One guide recalled seeing a woman in period dress pacing back and forward in front of a painting of the tower, her figure blurred, almost unfinished. There was nobody else in the room. The charter room is naturally a smaller space, but the activity there feels more intense. Different people have reported seeing a young boy crying, a clergyman standing silently, and an armed man staring across the room. They don't appear together, they seem to come separately, as if the room is holding too many memories, each one surfacing in turn. One staff member described it as a room where there's something always happening, even when you can't see it. But this solar room is the most notorious. Some won't go in. Others enter and leave quickly, shaken by what they feel. The main report is always the same. A man hanging from the rafters, eyes open, face pale, body still swaying. A few visitors have said they felt something tighten around their necks while standing there, brief, but real enough to send them downstairs in a hurry. The tower is still a functioning museum. It holds exhibitions, hosts tours, and offers history lessons. But the stories told there aren't always about monarchs or battles. Sometimes they're about other things. The sense that something or someone still lives on in the castle. That certain emotions or events left more than just historical traces. And that the people who walk through the tower now are not always alone. Across centuries and cultures, we've always marked a place where the dead are buried, sometimes with care, sometimes with grandeur, but almost always with intention. Stone, wood, earth shaped into something that says, this person was here, and now they're gone. Tombs like the one in Alloa weren't just built for mourning, they were built to last, to preserve a legacy, to hold a boundary. And when those boundaries are broken by time, by weather, by people who don't care or don't understand, something changes. Not always in a dramatic way, but enough that people notice, enough that stories start. Whether or not you believe in ghosts, there's something powerful in how we treat the places where others are laid to rest. Disturb them, and the unease that follows isn't always supernatural. Sometimes it's memory, sometimes it's guilt, and sometimes, just sometimes, it's something stranger. What happened at Tate's tomb may never be fully explained. Maybe it doesn't need to be. But, like the cracked stone and iron railings that surround it, the story now sits in the landscape, part of the town, part of the silence that settles in just before dark. Respect where the dead lie. Not because you're afraid of what might happen if you don't, but because it's what we've always done, and maybe what we're meant to do.